Okay, just real quick, we've talked about a lot of this information on the categorical slides. Okay, so, and we beat this horse to death, but the categorical standards that EPA developed are based on best available treatment technology. So basically, the anticipation is that these industries will have the latest and greatest technology on site. And in fact, we've had instances where categorical industries could meet their limits, and they're going to the city and asking for leniency because they just cannot meet the permit standards. And the first thing when EPA gets involved and evaluates that is they're asking does the industry have treatment on site, and if they don't, there's very little wiggle room there. The first step is for them to put treatment on site. Now, having said that, there are metal finishers that I've been to with no treatment whatsoever, but we're able to comply with federal standards just because their operation is so clean. And in most cases, the local limits are more stringent than the categorical standards anyway. But they are different. But the one they have to comply with the one that's more stringent. But so these categorical standards do not take into effect the impact on the treatment plant or the receiving stream whatsoever. They're just technology based versus technically based. And I mentioned before that the categorical standards are for indirect dischargers, and basically the term we use is effluent limited guidelines for the direct dischargers. And we talked about pre-treatment sources for existing source versus new source. Almost every category you're going to see standards under PS, ES, and PS, NS. And again, the difference primarily is the amount of time that they had to come into compliance with those standards when they discharge. And in reality, most cities won't allow new source dischargers to discharge until they can verify compliance. They have them hold the waste until they can show they're in compliance with the limits. But the regs do allow them 90 days primarily to tweak this new treatment system that they might have in place, make sure they can operate it properly. And again, here's your reference for the definition of new source. And there are a number of memorandums that go back through history that talk about new source and when it's applied, and they're all available on EPA's website. I will say that that's one of the things that headquarters is doing right now. And we're going to talk about categorical determinations, but all these categories have development documents that go into detail about how we came up with the numbers that we're imposing on these industries. And EPA is trying to put all those old development documents from the 70s and 80s on the EPA website, and when they can find them, every time I run across one, we copy and send it to EPA. We're going to post it on the website for everybody, but they're hard to find. We've already mentioned all this. Again, the whole concept is to level the playing field because they do get the benefit of discharging to a collection system where they do get some removal to the wastewater plant. The next 4 slides are basically just a benefit to you. It gives you a quick guide to the various categories that have been established and how these limits are set up. And some are production-based standards. If you look at the aluminum flooring, we'll talk more about that. And so this is just a good, quick reference for you if you're dealing with a particular categorical industry and how their limits are to be applied. One example I was going to point out, the ink formulation, their discharge standard is that there shall be no discharge or processed wastewater. That is the actual standard. And that's different from a zero discharge metal finisher who has chosen to minimize the amount of wastewater that their environmental footprint, basically they're shipping it off site, they put it down the sewer. That's different from somebody whose standard is no discharge. So this would have to be in their permit to say that they also not discharged from this process.
Are these ESLs the same ones as the ESLs for the NPDS permits?
Well, the numbers are different. The particular numerical standards will be different.
Okay.
But yeah,
right.
they're in the same.
Oh, I see.
Same document, same, yeah.
I get it.
But the numbers will be different.
The parts are the same. The 46
Yeah.
part number, but then the
421 applies to
Within the
direct and
standards,
indirect
yeah.
discharges,
Right.
but within that you have subparts, and within that you have pre-treatment standard for existing sources and new sources. You have best available technology. You have best achievable, whatever that is.
yeah, so,
BAP, yeah.
But this table can be found in multiple documents. It's in the IU permitting document by EPA, and it's also in the intro manual. So if you wanted,
There are tons of resources we've made available for you guys, I think, that you can take advantage of. And we've tried to put all of them on the EPA headquarters website. Then again, we'll talk about these more. I just want to point that one out in particular. Okay. So if you're asked to do a categorical determination, and basically the state and EPA are the ones who get final say-so on these, particularly because industry or cities don't really know, if they don't know or aren't familiar with a particular category, they got a new entity coming into town, they need help, you know, we tell them to call me. But you need, you know, so the questions you need to ask are, you know, what are they making and how are they making it, basically? You know, what sort of process are they using? What chemicals are on site? And then based on that, you can compare to the standards that, you know, you've got 4 tables there that you can evaluate, figure out what they're doing. Now, some categories have exceptions or exemptions from the regs. For example, metal finishing, the 433 metal finishing regs. If you're a metallic plate maker or gravure cylinder printer, such as typically the old process of printing newspaper, which has these huge long cylinders and they were basically copper plated and etched. They're not covered under the metal finishing, even though everything they do, you know, if it walks like a duck and looks like a duck, these are not ducks, because they had a really good lobbying agent when the regs were promulgated and they got exemption from the metal finishing regs. And that's really the only reason. And there are also different multiple categories that might apply to a particular industry, such as just because they have a metal finishing operation, if they're doing phosphatizing before they do painting, if they're doing that as a subset of coil coating when they're making Coke cans, or as a subset of aluminum forming, those industries those categories apply instead of metal finishing. And in the metal finishing regs, it spells out, you know, if they're studying any one of these other categories, then metal finishing does not apply. Now, if that metal finishing line is a completely separate line and the part does not go through the aluminum forming and the coil coating, then they would be subject to both of those standards. And then that makes your permitting a little more complex, we'll say. We don't talk in detail about permitting today. I think for the next training. Yeah. And here are some good references for you to get assistance with doing categorical determination. And I also know that you guys in Region 9 have some examples of categorical determinations that have been done in past years that are posted on your website.
Yeah, and if you have questions, just let me know. We've got many more in our files.
You get them every day.
Sometimes we're not.
Okay. Most of the categorical standards are in the numerical standards. Some have those narrative standards that say thou shalt not discharge. You're going to see them either in concentration, such as milligrams per liter, which is an example of the metal finishing, and they may be mass limits, pound per million pounds. Or aluminum forming is a production-based standard. OCPSF is the standard in the regs is a concentration, but the limit they have to meet is the mass that you get by multiplying their flow by that standard. And then others have best management practices. Some of the newer categories have been determined. EPA has incorporated BMPs, transportation equipment cleaning. I think maybe when they modified the pulp and paper board, when they included pollutant management plans in place. If they mandate that industry subject to these standards have to establish pollutant management plans to show how they're handling these chemicals on site. And that actually is a standard for them that they have to comply with. And with the streamlining changes to 403, we're given the option to develop equivalent limits. So if the standard was a concentration-based standard, the city wanted to impose it as a mass, then they had the right to convert that, and vice versa. And here's just some examples for you of how this is the metal finishing standard. This is for new sources, 433.17. The existing source is 433.15. And the only difference for metal finishing, the only difference here in the standard is for cadmium, and for existing sources, the maximum is 0.69, or and I don't remember what it is, 0.23 maybe for monthly average, but that's the only parameter that's different between those. And again, here's the metal molding and casting, and you see how the limits are applied in pounds per million pounds a day, just to give you some examples. And then, here's the OCPS app. Yeah, and this is, you see the standards are in a, concentration, but then the narrative statement up here says it is the mass limit that, you get by multiplying the flow times its value in the table. So, you have to be careful about understanding the regs and make sure you understand how they apply. Don't just assume that. And we often see that people are so used to dealing with the metal finishing standard, because it's the most commonly regulated industry across the country, that they assume every limit that's in these tables is milligrams per liter, and they apply it that way. The other thing they do is, again, they apply the direct discharge limits instead of the indirect discharge standard. And another problem that we see, you want to look for when you're doing audits for PCIs, and be careful of educate cities. In particular, the metal finishing regs have a total toxic organic standard, and then in one subset of that standard, they list all of the constituents that are covered under that TPO standard. Well, there are other categories that also have a total toxic organic standard, but the subset of constituents is different from the one in metal finishing, but they typically will use that metal finishing standard. So you can make sure that they're applying the correct, putting the right constituents for that. Again, I mentioned the DMP. Metal finishing has, where they can opt out of doing testing for total toxic organics if they develop a toxic organic management plan. And so they submit this plan to say how they're going to handle these wastes, and also they submit a certification statement every 6 months in lieu of monitoring. We do encourage the cities to monitor the PPOs these industries anyway, because they typically have a local limit that they can apply to it. But then some of the others, like I said, TEC and some of the newer ones, have pollutant management plan mandates. Here's another example of very specified standards. The steam electric says that there should be no discharge of PCBs. We actually had, up in East Tennessee, we had a city that was doing ambient monitoring and finding high levels of PCBs in the stream. And through investigation, we found about 2 dozen transformers that had been dumped into the receiving chamber, just buried at the bottom of the lake. So, which enforcement case follows that. But battery manufacturing, we mentioned one here. I think battery manufacturing is interesting because under one subpart they have that you can't discharge anything from particular processes, but battery manufacturing is one of the few categories where showers at the facility are actually considered categorical waste under one of the subparts, because in most cases it would be considered dilute waste.
Are battery recyclers covered?
No, just manufacturers. Now, if they're doing one of those manufacturing operations as part of the recycling process, then maybe, but for the most part.
Would smelting be covered then as a manufacturing process?
I don't know if it's covered under this particular category.
It wouldn't be under battery, it might be
Yeah,
under forming or maybe
Maybe under CW.
CW.
Yeah. I don't think so. Yeah. And what you find is you spend a lot of time out in the field. There are a lot of industries out there that everything they do, you would think that they have to be covered by a category, but they're not, because biodiesel is a good example. When the biodiesel facilities first came out, a lot of cities and states and EPA regions were permitting them as OCPSF, because essentially the process is the same as these organic chemical manufacturers. However, when the OCPSF regs were developed, there was no such thing as biodiesel, so clearly there was no intent to cover those facilities. So legally, they're not considered OCPSF, so it's not a categorical standard for them.
But they could be the local limits.
Most people permit them as an SIU and apply the local limits. But, I mean, Appendix U smells like an OCPSF facility. It's just the legalese of applying these standards. Again, this is just, I can't operate it. Okay, here we go. You guys can do math, but we have a lot of information that you're getting today that we won't necessarily cover with any detail just because of lack of time, but it's a good resource for you. So you can sit down and go through some of these calculations, but this is just walking through the process of converting, using production-based standards. And so what you have to have for the industry are average production rates for the, again, you want to see a minimum of a year average of production rate. I like to see 2 years if you can get it, and average flows as well. and then you can go through the math and calculate a standard. And again, we're just giving you numbers to plug into the formula, so it's pretty straightforward. And when you do the conversion, you get 2.6 milligram per liter. Now, this was the daily max, and we said in the previous slide that the monthly average was 0.002. So can you guess what the monthly average is? Everything's the same except that one number, so it's 1.3 milligrams per liter for the monthly average. So pretty straightforward. And I think we talked about this already too, but just real quick, you know, the general and specific prohibitions about not discharging anything that's going to cause a blockage in the stream or cause an explosion or whatever, that applies to everybody, the whole universe of non-domestic users. Categorical standards are very specific as who they apply to, and the local limits, definitely SIUs and categorical, and you may choose to get some non-SIUs and permit them and apply the local limits to them as well, or the city may choose to do that. This is pretty much the same thing. This is just a good reference for you guys when you're dealing with categorical industries and trying to figure out how they need to be permitted, or helping a city out in making those decisions. The only other thing that we talk about is there are some options for getting credit, basically getting some relief on categorical standards. 403.15 is a net gross calculation that basically says if an industry can show that the intake water has a measurable level of concentration of pollutants, that they can get relief from that. In other words, they can get an addition to their standard of the amount that's in there, provided that the PFW discharges to the same body of water that the intake water came from. And that's the big one. And until 2005, that could actually legally never be applied because there was a typo in the regs that said they had to meet all three conditions, and it was supposed to be or, and it said and. And one of the conditions was if their particular category allows for net gross calculation, and there's not an existing category that allows for net gross calculation. So nobody could really apply them. And then I don't know how many. Do you deal with any fundamentally different factor issues?
No.
Yeah, and it's basically if they have unusual circumstances with high concentrations or something of that nature, that they can request variance to the limits, but very few people have removal credits anymore either. So, any questions on local limits or categorical standards? Any more questions?
This may be a bit of a curveball, but in terms of both the inspections and some of the chemistries we're seeing, have we had situations thus far where interactions between things discharged by different industrial facilities have caused problems and figured out how to regulate that?
Yes, we have. But because they'll say, they're going, there's no way we caused that. You didn't. Maybe your waste alone didn't cause it, but when it mixed with your neighbors or somebody else in the next neighborhood, absolutely, yeah. And cities have been able to show that and take enforcement action. Now, sometimes the state has to get involved.
Right, because I'm wondering how complex that is.
Yeah, and the one I've dealt with most recently, the state actually got involved. For the most part, it is the state stepping up to the plate and backing the city is what it amounts to. Just like, you've got EPA about where you're already getting. But, and it's the same concept at the city level. Pre-treatment coordinators can't do an effective job if their management is not supporting them, and that's why it's our job as regulators to make sure that their management understands that. And we've had instances where mayors have let industries come into town and not even tell the wastewater plant. There's money in their back pocket. The plater that I mentioned that was discharging in 5-gallon buckets, he moved from town to town to town in West Tennessee, and he was just moved to an existing building, and the wastewater people would never know he was there. He was paying some politician to let him get a permit without anybody knowing about it. And that happens all the time. And so we emphasize getting management involved, and a lot of it's an education process. And, in fact, recently I was just telling a city procurement coordinator that they need to volunteer to go speak in front of the city council and educate them on what the procurement program is, and so maybe they'll get more help in the program. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think when you calculate the equivalent concentration limit, the parameters you use that, I'm not quite sure if I understand what you mean by production limit and average daily production value.
This one?
Yeah, right here?
Yeah.
Okay. the production limit is the number that's in the categorical standards.
Okay.
And I'll give you a number. In the standard, it says the production limit is 0.004 kilograms of copper per ton of product.
Okay.
Okay, the production value is how many tons of product they're actually manufacturing.
Manufacturing,
Yeah,
okay.
and when you multiply those two, then you're gonna get, and divide by the flow, you're
By
gonna
the
get your
flow,
standard.
divided by the flow, okay.